All right, this is 2 of 2. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about presidential character and then go back and go over something really quickly. So let's go back to presidential character. So, can you hear my dog chewing her bone? I know it's fascinating, but I want you to see that I'm just kind of sitting here in my home doing this, and this is not a highly professional studio, which I know many of you were thinking, my gosh, this is so professional, it must be done in a high-tech studio. Anyway, going back to the PowerPoint, I want to talk about presidential character, and I also want to show the slide. So let's see. Oh, here we go. Play from current slide. All right, so this is an idea that a political science named James David Barber came up with. And basically, a lot of the analyses of the president either had to do with how they wielded power or the historical circumstances they found themselves in. Certainly, when we look at presidents we think who are rated as being great presidents, whether it be Abraham Lincoln or Franklin Delano Roosevelt or Ronald Reagan, they tend to have been creatures of their times, right? Of course, Abraham Lincoln had to deal with the issue of slavery in the Civil War. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had the Great Depression, and Ronald Reagan had the Cold War, and some economic issues as well. But at some point, the argument is that does character matter? Or the question is, does character matter? And Barber says, yes, it does. And basically, what he did is he came up with a two ways essentially to measure presidential character. The first way is the issue of active versus passive. That is the president there to be a caretaker and just kind of, keep things going, or does the president have an activist agenda where he's trying to make big changes? And what is what is the president's agenda? So, for example, active presidents have been Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Richard Nixon's been considered an active president, Lyndon B. Johnson, whereas people like Dwight Eisenhower have been considered more passive. I'm sure you all remember the Eisenhower administration. Positive versus negative is really their attitude toward power. Do they see power as a good thing, and do they like power, or do they see it in negative terms and something that is a problem? And his argument is that character does matter, that active, positive presidents tend to do a lot of great things in terms of getting their agenda done. And as for so many people in the 60s and 70s, Franklin Roosevelt was the example of the active, positive president who had an agenda, saw power as something that was good, and was able to use it to get through a lot of changes in the American government. But what really put him on the map, so to speak, was his analysis of then President Nixon. He argued that Nixon was active negative, meaning he wanted to get things done, but he saw power in a negative sense, and he predicted that President Nixon would have some political issues. And lo and behold, he certainly did. He ended up resigning, and it made James David Barber seem as if there was something to his analysis, and so people started to pay attention to that. So the question is, in looking at a president, are they active or passive, positive or negative? And it brings up the question of how people would analyze Donald Trump. That is, do we see him as having an active agenda that is pursuing very specific things, or is he passive? Is he positive in the way he looks at power, or is he negative? And so it's something to think about. How would you categorize President Trump? Now I want to go back a little bit and highlight something. When I talked about the president as chief legislator, I said we would get back to vetoes, and we didn't because I was supposed to talk to it then. And I would urge you to go to page 330 of your textbook, because basically it says, discusses the president's options when he vetoes it. So if a president is given a piece of legislation, basically there are four possibilities. One is the president signs it, it becomes law. Number two is if the president doesn't sign it, it can be law without the president's signature. So sometimes the president will say, well, I really don't want to veto this bill, but I'm not that crazy about it. It'll become law without their signature. However, the president can reject the bill, veto it, and send it back to Congress with a message with the president's objectives, objections. Congress can change the bill, or they can reject the president's objections. Okay, it takes 2/3 of a vote of both houses of Congress to override a veto. And if you look on page 331, you'll see how hard it is to override a veto. Not surprising, given that it's difficult for Congress to do things with a 50% rule. And then if the president doesn't sign the bill and Congress adjourns within 10 days, it's what's called a pocket veto, meaning since Congress isn't around to override the veto or to accept the veto, it basically gets vetoed on a technicality. So think about those when you start thinking about how a bill becomes a law. Certainly there's the congressional process, but there's also the process that the president is involved in. And that is a summary of some of the ideas and issues surrounding the presidency. I hope you found this to be interesting and a good supplement to what's in the text.